Today we are going to be solving quadratic equations using square roots. So quadratic equations, we talked about those last semester, or actually we talked about quadratic functions. Those are the ones that create the parabola. Today we are actually going to be looking at equations. That means we're looking for, similar to what would happen when it crossed the x-axis, or where two parabolas meet. So we're looking for some type of solution. So we are looking for locations. And when we were dealing with parabolas, and we looked at when it crossed the x-axis, sometimes it crossed, sometimes it didn't cross, and sometimes there were two solutions. So on these, we are really, when you're solving equations, going to end up with one or two solutions every single time. Most of the time, you're going to end up with two. Let's take the first problem. Number 1, x squared equals 36. On these, the big goal is to get your square root or your squared term isolated, and then take the root of both sides. So in this case, the radical or the square term is by itself. So the next step is going to be just take the square root of both sides. And so x is equal to 6. But that's not the only number that would have worked in that scenario. It's also equal to -6, because I could have done -6 times -6 and ended up with 36. So when you take the root, you will always have the positive and the negative of that number. One way to write it is like this. Or it could also be written with the sign that looks like a plus sign over a minus. That's plus or minus 6. This is the most common way of seeing it written. But you could also list off the individual factors. Let's do another one. So this time we have x minus 7. That whole thing squared is equal to 32. Well, if I look, I have my squared term by itself. So that means that my next step is to take the square root of both sides. And remember, I'm looking at the positive and negative of that side. So positive plus or minus the square root of 32. Is the square root of 32 something I can take? The answer is no. So that means I need to think about what are the factors, how can I simplify the square root of 32? So 32 is made up of several factors, and we can go through and do the factorization like we did last unit. And we end up with 32 is made up of 5 different 2's. And so if I'm doing the square root, that means I have 2 different sets that can come out and one that's going to stay behind. So when I simplify that, it's going to be 4 times the square root of 2. Now let's go ahead and look at the other side. The square root of a squared item leaves me what is inside. And I'm just going to write it down on the next line. Now I need to get the x by itself. So I add 7 to both sides. When we add something with a radical and something without, they cannot combine, just like you can't combine if it had an x in one and no x on the other. The typical way you'll write it is the one with the radical gets written last. And so it was a positive 7 plus or minus 4 square roots of 2. And that is your answer. Question 3. We don't have the square term by itself yet, so you need to first move the other things away. And we end up with 4x squared is equal to 48. Now, I need to divide both sides by 4. And so that would be canceling out over here. And so we have x squared is equal to 12. Now we have the square root by itself. We take the square root of both sides. And so x is equal to the plus or minus, positive or negative. Now, 12 is a prime, so I need to think, is there any perfect square factors that can come out of 12? So divide 12 by 2, I get 6. Divide it by 2, I get 3. So I have a set of 2's that can come out. So 2 times the square root of 3. That's my answer.